November came to Ashwell Grange the way a creditor comes to a door that has not been answered in months. Patient at first, then insistent, then simply present, as though it had always been standing there and always would be. It arrived in the color of the elm trees, stripped down to their arguments, in the smell of wet stone and wood smoke thinned too far because the wood was rationed now, in the particular grey light that made even the good silver look tarnished. The house had once worn its dignity, the way a woman wears a coat that still fits. But 3 years of thin harvests, and a father 2 years in his grave, had turned the coat threadbare, and Margaret Alden had learned to stop noticing the cold in the east wing, because there was no sense grieving a room she could not afford to heat. She was 24, and she had the hands of a woman twice that, chapped from lye and cold water, capable hands, competent hands, hands that had kept a household of 6 alive on the income meant for 2. She did not think of herself as poor. Poor was a word for people who had given up, and Margaret Alden had not given up on anything. Not the roof, not her younger brother's Latin lessons, not the last of her mother's rose bushes, which she pruned every October with a care that bordered on prayer, though she could not have said what she was praying for. Perhaps only that something, somewhere, would come easier than it had. The house itself seemed to hold its breath through these months, its shutters drawn early to save the candles, its great hall reduced to a single warm room where the family gathered like animals conserving heat, its once loud kitchen down to a cook, a girl of 15, who did the work of 3, and Margaret, who had stopped pretending the mistress of the house did not scrub pots. Fewer logs on the fire, fewer candles in the sconces, fewer callers at the door, because word had gone round the county that the Aldens had nothing left to offer but conversation, and conversation did not fill a carriage with reasons to visit. She did not cry over any of it. She had cried, once, the week after her father's funeral, in the cold dark of the linen closet where no one could see her, and she had decided, with the same practical finality she brought to mending a torn hem, that crying solved nothing, and warmth was in short enough supply without wasting it on her own face. Her mother had taken to her bed with a grief that had never quite lifted, more shadow than woman these days, and so it had fallen to Margaret, eldest and unmarried and entirely without a dowry worth the name, to be the spine the house leaned on. She did not resent it. She told herself she did not resent it. The way she told herself the wind through the cracked window in her room was invigorating rather than simply cold. On the evening this story begins, she was in the kitchen garden at dusk, wrapped in her mother's old grey shawl, the one colour she wore now, plain and unremarkable, the colour of a woman who had stopped dressing to be seen. She was cutting the last of the hardy herbs before the frost took them, rosemary and thyme gone woody with the season, and she worked with the particular calm of someone who found order in small tasks, because the large ones were beyond her control. The sky had gone the colour of a healing bruise, purple-grey at the edges, and somewhere beyond the low stone wall, a fox was crying, thin and eerie, the sound carrying strangely on the cold air. She straightened once to look at the house, its windows mostly dark, one small square of amber light burning in the great hall, where her brothers were meant to be at their books and were very likely not. A house in mourning for itself, she thought, and was faintly surprised at her own poetry, and put the thought away as she put away everything that did not help with supper. She had no way of knowing, cutting rosemary in the failing light, that the county road 1/2 mile distant carried, at that very hour, a solitary rider whose arrival would unmake the careful, narrow peace she had built for herself out of duty and thin soup, and the refusal to weep. She had no way of knowing that the letter, already sitting unopened on the hall table, delivered that afternoon and set aside because there had been bread to bake, contained a sentence that would end the only life she had ever imagined for herself. She only knew that the herbs wanted cutting before the frost, and that her hands were cold, and that somewhere in the dark beyond the wall, a fox continued to cry, as though it too sensed a change coming on the wind, and did not welcome it. The letter was read at last by candlelight, after supper had been cleared, and her brothers sent up with their tallow stub to light the stairs. And Margaret broke the seal with the same unhurried patience she brought to everything, expecting a bill or a condolence letter arrived late, or news of some cousin's marriage that would cost them a gift they could not spare. What she found instead was her own name, written in a clerk's careful hand, followed by a proposal so strange in its formality that she read it 3 times before the sense of it settled into her stomach like a stone dropped into still water. Her late father, it seemed, had incurred a debt some years before his death to a man of considerable rank, a debt secured not with land, for there had been little enough of that to offer, but with a private understanding between 2 old friends, that should the debt go unresolved, the matter would be settled through the joining of the families. The Duke of Hallowmere, the letter explained in the bloodless language of solicitors, wished to discharge his late friend's memory honourably, and proposed marriage to the eldest Alden daughter. The terms generous, the settlement more than sufficient to restore Ashwell Grange and secure her brother's futures, the wedding to take place within the season. There was no mention of affection, because none had been promised, and none was expected. It was, in every particular, a transaction, cold as the November air outside, and Margaret sat very still with the paper in her lap, and felt something in her chest that was not quite relief, and not quite grief, but some third, nameless thing that lived in the narrow country between them. She thought of her mother, pale in her bed, and her brother's unpatched boots, and the roses she pruned every October as though they were a promise she intended to keep. And she thought, with the same steady practicality that had carried her through 3 years of quiet ruin, that a woman without a dowry did not refuse rescue on the grounds that it arrived without romance. She would write her acceptance in the morning. It was while she sat turning this new architecture of her life over in her mind that the knock came at the kitchen door. Not the front, for the front bell had not rung, and no carriage wheels had sounded on the drive. Only a low, uneven knock at the servants' entrance, the kind a beggar gives who has learned not to expect much. The cook had gone to her room above the scullery, and so it was Margaret who carried the single remaining candle down the cold passage and opened the door onto a man she did not know and did not trust on sight. He was tall and cloaked in something once fine and now filthy with the road, mud to the knee, his hair dark and disordered, a growth of several days' beard shadowing a face gaunt with what looked like genuine hunger, and his eyes, when they met hers in the candlelight, were a pale, striking grey that seemed strange in so ragged a frame, though she did not dwell on it. He asked, in a voice rough with cold, only for a seat by the fire and whatever bread the house could spare. Said he had lost his horse to a ditch 2 miles back and walked the rest in the dark. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, this stranger with his fine, ruined cloak and his unplaceable manner of speech, too careful for a common vagrant, and felt not sympathy, but a kind of exhausted alarm, the particular fear of a woman alone with her mother ill upstairs and her brothers small and asleep, and no manservant left in the house since Thomas had been let go at Michaelmas for want of wages. She thought of everything a stranger in the house might mean, at night, with no protector, and she thought of the thin remaining store of bread meant for tomorrow's breakfast, and she made her decision the way she made all her decisions now, with her family's safety weighed heavier than any stranger's need. She told him, with a courtesy that did not soften the refusal, that she could not admit him, that the village lay 2 miles further on, and the inn there would give him a bed for whatever coin he carried, and that she wished him a safe journey. She did not soften it with an apology, because apology cost something she did not have to spare, and she shut the door on his silence before he had finished drawing breath to answer, and stood for a moment in the cold passage, with her heart beating hard, telling herself she had done the only sensible thing, while somewhere behind her eyes, unbidden, she saw again the particular grey of his eyes, and could not think why it troubled her so. She told no one of the man at the door, not that night nor the next morning, because there seemed nothing to tell. A beggar turned away, the ordinary small cruelty that poverty taught even the kind, and she had larger matters pressing. She wrote her acceptance to the solicitor before the frost had fully lifted from the windows, In a hand she kept deliberately steady, and carried the letter herself the mile into the village, rather than trust it to wait another day in the hall, as though speed might make the strange bargain feel less like a thing done to her, and more like a thing she had chosen. Her mother wept when she was told, not from sorrow, but from a relief so sudden it looked, for a moment, indistinguishable from grief, and pressed Margaret's hands between her own thin ones, and said her father would have been glad of it, glad his old debt could be turned to his daughter's good, rather than her ruin. Her brothers, 12 and 9, were too young to understand a duke from a fairy story, and asked only whether there would be a horse they might ride when they visited, and Margaret found she could laugh at that, a small, dry laugh, the first in some time. It was her father's old friend, and the family's nearest thing to an ally, a widowed aunt by marriage named Mrs. Pruitt, sharp-tongued and sharper-eyed, who came to sit with her the evening before she was to leave for Hallowmere, and who said, over a cup of tea too weak to be worth the leaves, that she had known the old Duke of Hallowmere in her girlhood, and that his son, the present Duke, was said to be a cold and solitary sort of man, unmarried past 30, and in no hurry to remedy it, a man who buried himself in his estate's affairs and had not been seen at a London ball in 3 years running. There are worse things than a cold husband, Mrs. Pruitt said, setting down her cup with the particular finality of a woman who had buried 2 husbands of her own, and formed decided opinions on the matter. A cold husband leaves a woman her own mind, which is more than can be said for a warm fool. Margaret had laughed again at that, and asked whether her aunt had any comfort at all to offer, but was not so thoroughly practical, and Mrs. Pruitt had said, without missing a stitch of her needlework, that comfort was a luxury for women with dowries, and that Margaret would do better to arm herself with sense than with hope. It was not unkindly meant, and Margaret did not take it unkindly, for she had armed herself with sense for 3 years now, and saw no reason to lay down that particular weapon on the eve of the largest transaction of her life. She packed what little she owned worth taking, her mother's shawl among it, though it was hardly fashionable enough for a duchess, and told herself, lying awake that last night in the room that had been hers since childhood, listening to the wind work at the loose shutter she had never had mended, that she was not afraid, that fear was another luxury she had long since given up, that whatever waited at Hallowmere could not be colder than 3 winters of counting candle stubs. She thought, once, unwillingly, of the ragged traveller at her door, of the strange, pale grey of his eyes and the hunger in his face, and felt a small, unfamiliar guilt she could not entirely account for, and told herself firmly that a woman could not save every stranger who knocked, not when she had a household to protect, and closed her eyes on the thought and did not examine it further. The carriage came for her 3 days later, finer than any that had stood in the Granger's drive in a decade, and her mother wept again at the door, and her brothers ran alongside it down the drive until their legs gave out, and Margaret watched her home shrink behind her through the small window, the house that had held her whole, narrow, dutiful life, and did not cry, because crying was a luxury, and because whatever else this bargain was, it was also the only chance she would ever have to make the fading, breath-held house behind her whole again. And for that, she would have married a stranger, colder than any winter Ashwell Grange had ever known. She did not look back a second time, for looking back, she had long ago decided, was another luxury reserved for women who could afford the sentiment, and instead fixed her eyes forward, on the unfamiliar road ahead, watching hedgerows and bare fields slide past the window in the fading light, and tried, without much success, to summon some clear picture of the man she was travelling toward, a cold and solitary duke she had never once laid eyes on, and found she could conjure nothing but a vague impression of rank and distance, a title rather than a face, which, she supposed, was fitting enough for a bargain struck on paper and sealed by a dead man's debt, rather than any living affection. Hallowmere announced itself long before the carriage reached it, rising out of the parkland like something not built so much as grown. Grey stone gone silver where the light caught it, windows uncountable, a house so vast that Margaret's own home could have been folded into a single wing and forgotten. She had expected to feel triumph, or at least the small, mean satisfaction of a bargain concluded, and instead felt only smaller than she had ever felt in her life. A woman in a mended traveling dress, stepping down into a world built at a scale meant for people who had never once counted candle stubs. The staff assembled to receive her with a formality that made her spine go rigid with the effort of appearing unafraid. A butler named Hargrove, whose face gave away nothing at all. A housekeeper, Mrs. Denby, whose eyes travelled once, briefly, over the plainness of Margaret's dress, and betrayed the smallest, most carefully suppressed flicker of something that might have been pity, or might have been contempt. Margaret could not tell which, and told herself it did not matter. She was shown to rooms grander than any she had occupied. A bedchamber with a fireplace large enough to roast an ox, and hung with silk the colour of a robin's egg. And she stood alone in the centre of it, after the maids had gone, in a silence so complete it had a texture, and felt the full strangeness of her situation settle over her, like the cold that had once lived in the east wing of her old home. Though this cold, she noted with a kind of grim humour, was considerably better upholstered. She was told, gently but firmly, that His Grace was from home on estate business, and would not return for some days yet, that the wedding would proceed on his return, according to the arrangements already settled, and that she was to consider herself mistress of the house from this hour forward, a title that felt, standing alone in that vast silk room, more like a sentence than an honour. She did not weep, though the temptation, for the first time in 3 years, pressed close and insistent behind her eyes. Instead, she did what she had always done, which was find the nearest task and bury herself in it. She explored the house not as a bride admiring her future, but as a housekeeper assessing a battlefield, and found, beneath the grandeur, a great deal of quiet neglect, rooms shuttered and dust-sheeted that had once clearly been alive, a library gone cold and unused, a conservatory of dead plants in cracked pots, a long gallery of family portraits that no one, it seemed, had dusted in a season. The house was rich, but it was not warm, and Margaret, who understood the difference between wealth and warmth better than most women of her acquaintance, felt something in her that was not quite pity and not quite recognition stir at the sight of all that cold, abandoned grandeur. She asked Mrs. Denby on her second day why the conservatory had been let go, and the housekeeper's face closed like a shutter, as she said only that it had been the late Duchess's favourite room, and that His Grace did not care to have it discussed. And Margaret, sensing a wound she did not yet understand, let the matter drop, though she found herself, unbidden, sweeping the conservatory floor herself that same afternoon, unable to leave so much sorrowful neglect standing. That night, alone at the long dining table, set with silver enough for 20 and laid, absurdly, for 1, she thought again, as she had not quite managed to stop thinking these past days, of the ragged traveller at her own kitchen door, and felt the guilt return sharper now, here in this house of such staggering plenty, where she herself had been received with cold formality, despite every courtesy owed her rank, and understood, in some small and uncomfortable way, what it might be to arrive somewhere hungry, and be turned away by a woman who had reasons, good reasons, sound and sensible reasons, and still had turned him away. She resolved, sitting very straight at that long, cold table, that whatever else this marriage made of her, she would not let Hallowmere make her cold, not the house, and not herself. And she began, in her own quiet and unglamorous way, the very next morning, to see what a single, determined woman, with capable hands and no dowry at all, might do to bring a house back to life. She rose before the rest of the household had stirred, and walked the cold corridors alone, mapping in her mind which rooms wanted airing first and which fires wanted lighting, and felt, for the first time since the carriage had carried her away from Ashwell Grange, something almost like purpose settle back into her chest, familiar and steadying, the same quiet resolve that had once kept a fading household fed through 3 hard winters, now turned toward a grander, colder house that seemed, in its own vast and silent way, every bit as much in need of her stubborn care. She began with the conservatory, because it was the wound she had already glimpsed, and because Margaret Alden had never in her life met a dying garden she did not feel a personal obligation to save. She asked no permission, for there was no one present to grant it, and spent her mornings with her sleeves pinned back and her hands, once again, chapped with work, clearing dead growth and turning cold soil, and coaxing the old stovepipes back into service so the glass room might hold its heat through the nights. The gardener, an elderly man named Fitch, who had clearly expected nothing from the new mistress but ornamental supervision, watched her the first day with open suspicion, and by the third had begun quietly setting out the tools she wanted before she asked for them, a small, wordless alliance formed over shared dirt and shared purpose. She moved through the rest of the house the same way, unshuttering rooms that had sat dark for want of anyone troubling to open them, having the long gallery's portraits properly dusted, and the library's cold grate finally lit, not with any grand design, but with the same instinct that had kept Ashwell Grange breathing through 3 lean winters. The simple, stubborn conviction that a house left to go cold would eventually forget how to be warm at all. The staff, guarded at first, softened by degrees, the way staff always softened toward a mistress who did not consider herself above the work of the house. And by the end of the second week, Mrs. Denby had begun bringing her tea without being asked, and the youngest housemaid had taken to lingering in doorways to watch her work, with an admiration she made no effort to hide. It was into this half-restored house, warmer already than the one she had first entered, that the Duke of Hallowmere returned on a grey afternoon 11 days after her arrival, and Margaret, informed of his return by a breathless underfootman while she was up to her elbows in conservatory soil, had time only to wash her hands and smooth her plain grey dress before she was summoned to the drawing-room to meet, for the first time, by name and title, the man she was to marry within the fortnight. She walked the long corridor toward the drawing-room with her spine straight and her sense fully armed, as Mrs. Pruitt had counselled, prepared for a stranger, prepared for coldness, prepared, she told herself, for anything at all, except what she found when the doors opened, and she looked across the room, into a face she recognized at once, clean-shaven now, and dressed in clothes of unmistakable quality, but unmistakably, unforgivably, the same face, the same pale, striking grey eyes that had looked at her from her own kitchen doorstep 3 weeks before, the same man she had turned away into the cold November dark, with nothing but directions to an inn he could not have afforded. The floor seemed to tilt very slightly beneath her. He did not smile, and did not move to close the distance between them, only watched her with an expression she could not read, something guarded and still, and faintly, she thought, amused. Though she could not imagine what, in this moment, could possibly amuse him. It was Hargrove who broke the silence, announcing with perfect gravity that Miss Alden had the honour of meeting His Grace the Duke of Hallowmere, and Margaret, who had faced down creditors and grief and a house full of cold rooms without once losing her composure, felt her carefully built composure crack directly down its centre, as understanding arrived in full, humiliating force. She had turned away a hungry traveller from her own door on the coldest night of the season, and the traveller had been the very man she had crossed a county and abandoned her whole former life to marry. And there was no version of the sentence she might now offer that did not begin with the words, "I am sorry," spoken to a man who had every reason in the world never to believe her again. She thought, in the strange, suspended moment before either of them found their voice, of every small kindness she had denied him without knowing his name. The bread she had not offered, the fire she had not let him warm himself by, the 2 miles of cold, dark road she had sent him walking into alone, and felt the weight of it settle over her, not as simple embarrassment, but as something closer to grief. The grief of a woman who had prided herself on her own good sense, discovering that good sense and rightness were not always, after all, the very same thing. He, for his part, said nothing further for a long moment, only continued to watch her with that same unreadable stillness. And Margaret found herself wondering, with a fresh unease she could not quite name, what manner of man stood before her, now that the ragged cloak had been exchanged for fine wool and the hunger for composure, whether the traveller's rough honesty had been a mask now discarded, or whether it was this cool, contained duke who was, in fact, the more careful performance of the two. He let the silence stretch longer than kindness required, and Margaret, standing very straight with her hands folded to keep them from trembling, understood that he was allowing her to feel the full weight of it before he spoke, though whether from cruelty or simple habit of a reserved man, she could not yet tell. When he finally spoke, his voice was the same rough voice from the doorstep, though warmed now, wry, entirely too composed for her comfort. He said only that he hoped the inn 2 miles further on had suited him better than her own fire, and Margaret felt her face go hot with an embarrassment sharper than any she had known since her father's death, and found, to her own surprise, that she would not apologize in the small, grovelling way the moment seemed to invite. Instead, she lifted her chin, in the manner Mrs. Pruitt had taught her, and said that a woman alone at night, with her mother ill and no manservant in the house, did not open her door to strangers on the strength of their manners, however fine their cloak, and that she would make the same choice again tonight if the same stranger came knocking, however much she now regretted a particular stranger it had turned out to be. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the almost. He said, after a moment, that it was, in fact, the most sensible answer anyone at Hallowmere had given him in a decade, and that he had walked the 2 miles to the inn, cursing her thoroughly the entire way, and had arrived to find the innkeeper equally unmoved by his ruined cloak, and had slept, the Duke of Hallowmere, on a public settle by a taproom fire, which he considered, on reflection, a fitting education for a man who had spent rather too many years being given whatever he asked for on the strength of his name alone. It was, Margaret realized slowly, as close to an apology as a duke's pride was likely to offer, and she found herself, despite everything, wanting to smile back at him, and did not quite let herself. We'll pause the story here for just a moment. If you don't want to miss what happens next between Margaret and the Duke, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us keep bringing these stories to you. Now, back to Hallowmere. He explained in the days that followed, delivered in the same clipped, unadorned sentences she was coming to recognize as his native tongue, that he had ridden out ahead of his own arrival, unannounced, wishing to see the woman his father's old debt had bound him to before either of them was required to perform affection they did not feel, and that the ditch and the lost horse had been genuine misfortune rather than design, though he admitted, with the faintest curl of that almost smile, that arriving at her door as a beggar had told him a great deal more about her character than a formal introduction ever could have. Margaret did not know what to do with a man who thanked her, however obliquely, for turning him away, and found herself watching him with a wary curiosity she had not expected to feel for a man she had been prepared to marry as a matter of pure practical necessity. He was, she began to see over the following fortnight, not cold so much as guarded, a man who had learned, for reasons no one at Hallowmere would yet discuss with her, to keep his rooms shuttered the way she had once kept her own heart carefully shuttered against the cost of hope. And she recognized in him, with the particular clarity of a woman who had done the same thing herself, the shape of a person conserving warmth, because warmth, once spent freely, had cost him something he had not yet recovered. She watched him, unasked, press a coin into old Fitch's hand for a kindness the gardener had shown a stray dog on the grounds, watched him speak, briefly and without performance, to the youngest footman about the boy's ailing mother. Small, unshowy acts he plainly did not intend anyone to notice, and each one chipped, quietly, at the cold first impression she had carried with her from her own doorstep, until she found herself, against every sensible instinct Mrs. Pruitt had armed her with, beginning to look forward to the hour each evening when he came to sit, wordless at first, and then gradually less so, in the newly warmed library, and ask her, in his rough, clipped voice, what she had done to the conservatory that had made old Fitch, of all unsentimental men, look almost happy. What Margaret did not see, because he took great care she should not, was the hour after their evening conversations ended, when the Duke of Hallowmere remained alone in his study, with a single candle burning low, and thought, with an unease that had become entirely too familiar these past weeks, of how thoroughly a woman in a plain grey shawl had undone 11 years of carefully maintained solitude. He had built his guardedness the way a man builds a house against flood, brick by deliberate brick, ever since the winter his mother died in the very conservatory Margaret had now brought back to life. A loss that had taught him, at 19, that warmth given freely could be taken away without warning or mercy, and that a man did his family and his tenants and his own battered heart a greater kindness by keeping the doors of himself shut than by risking that particular grief twice. He had agreed to this marriage as a debt discharged, nothing more, had expected a stranger he might treat with courtesy and distant respect, and nothing resembling feeling, and had instead found, first at his own near-frozen doorstep, and now within his own walls, a woman whose plain dress and chapped hands concealed a dignity so entire it made every glittering woman he had met in a decade of London ballrooms look like a poorly painted stage set by comparison. He did not yet know what to do with the fact that he had begun, without permission from himself, to listen for her voice down the corridor before he admitted to listening for it at all. It was into this fragile, half-thawed piece that Lady Cordelia Fenwick arrived, a distant cousin of the late Duchess, and a woman whose beauty was spoken of in 3 counties with the same reverent certainty as the weather, golden-haired and exquisitely dressed, and entirely aware of the effect she produced upon entering a room, who had, it emerged over the course of one uncomfortable dinner, long considered herself the natural and eventual mistress of Hallowmere, an understanding she had apparently formed some years before on grounds no one but herself had ever fully agreed to. Her civility toward Margaret in company was a thing of exquisite, surgical precision, every compliment constructed to draw attention to the very things it claimed to praise past. The plainness of Margaret's gown noted as refreshingly unaffected, her lack of connections mentioned as charmingly without artifice, each remark landing with a small private cut that Margaret, who had faced down creditors without flinching, found somehow harder to bear than open cruelty would have been. It escalated by careful degrees over the following days. A remark dropped at cards about certain persons marrying rather above their station and being ill-equipped for the burdens that followed. A story told with wide, innocent eyes at the local assembly about a debt discharged through marriage, as though the entire arrangement were common knowledge and common scandal both, until Margaret understood, watching the careful, delighted way the story travelled from ear to ear across the assembly room, that Lady Cordelia intended not merely to wound her, but to make her position at Hallowmere untenable before the wedding itself could take place. Margaret did not weep, though the temptation returned sharper than it had been since her arrival, and she did not appeal to the Duke for rescue, telling herself, with the same stubborn practicality that had carried her through 3 cold winters, that she had not crossed a county to marry a man on the strength of gratitude for his defense, and that whatever dignity she still possessed, she would defend herself. But she began, for the first time since her father's death, to feel the old cold creeping back in at the edges of her composure, the particular loneliness of being watched and found wanting by a room full of people who had decided her worth before she had ever spoken a word. And she caught the Duke, once, across a crowded card table, watching Lady Cordelia's performance, with an expression gone entirely still and unreadable, and could not tell, in that terrible, uncertain moment, whether his silence meant he had not yet decided where his loyalty lay, or whether he was simply, as was his habit, waiting for the precise moment when speech would do more good than restraint. That night, alone in her room, she took out her mother's grey shawl and held it a long while without putting it on, thinking of Ashwell Grange and the 3 cold winters that had taught her to expect very little from rooms full of glittering people, and told herself that whatever Lady Cordelia intended, she had survived worse than whispered scandal, had survived her father's death and her mother's grief and a house gone silent with want, and that a woman who had buried those griefs without breaking would not now be undone by a beautiful stranger's careful cruelty, however much, in the private dark of her own room, it cost her more than she was willing to admit, even to herself. The ball at Hallowmere had been planned before Margaret's arrival, a long-standing tradition to open the county's winter season, and Lady Cordelia, who had appointed herself an authority on every particular of it, made certain by the week of the event that all the right ears had heard all the right whispers, so that Margaret walked into her own betrothed's ballroom under the weight of 100 curious, calculating glances, women who smiled with their mouths and measured her with their eyes, murmurs that dropped just low enough to be certain of being overheard. She wore for the occasion not the fine new gowns the Duke's own seamstress had pressed upon her, silks and satins in colours chosen to flatter a duchess, but her mother's grey shawl over a simple dress of her own choosing, a small, quiet act of defiance she had decided on alone in her room that afternoon, some stubborn refusal to be dressed into a performance of a woman she was not. And she walked into that glittering room with her chin lifted, exactly as Mrs. Pruitt had taught her, though her heart beat hard enough to be heard, she was certain, by anyone standing close. Lady Cordelia found her within the first quarter hour, resplendent in blue silk, and delivered, before an audience she had clearly gathered on purpose, her cruelest performance yet. A long, glittering speech about the charm of unconventional matches, and the particular courage it took for a woman of no fortune and no name to step into shoes so very much too large for her, phrased with such elegant cruelty that half the room laughed before they had quite finished deciding whether laughing was appropriate. Margaret felt the old counted seconds begin. 1, 2, 3. The held breath of a room, waiting to see whether she would break. And she opened her mouth to answer as best she could. Sensible words, careful words. When a voice cut across the ballroom that was not raised, that did not need to be raised, because the Duke of Hallowmere had never in his life needed to raise his voice to command a room's complete attention. He crossed the floor to stand at Margaret's side, and the crowd's murmur died the way wind dies at the closing of a door, and he said, in the clipped, unadorned sentences that were entirely his own, that he had been a soldier's son and a duke's heir, and had met, in 30 years of both, a great many people whose worth was measured in silk and connections, and found, without exception, that such worth wore thin the first time it was asked to survive a hard winter. He said he had arrived at Miss Alden's own door 3 weeks before this very ball, ragged and unrecognized, and had been refused entry, not out of unkindness, but out of a courage most of the glittering people in this room had never once been required to summon. The courage of a woman alone, protecting an ailing mother and 2 young brothers, with nothing but her own 2 hands and her own good sense, at an hour when a wrong decision might have cost her family everything. He said he had not chosen her for her fortune, of which she had none, nor for her connections, of which she had fewer, nor for any of the small glittering currencies this room traded in so freely. He had chosen her, he said, and here his voice, for the first time since Margaret had known him, lost some measure of its careful control, for the particular dignity of a woman who kept a fire burning for people who could offer her nothing in return, and who had, in the space of 3 short weeks, done more to restore warmth to this cold house than a decade of his own careful management had managed alone. He turned then, not to the room, but to Lady Cordelia specifically, and said, with a quiet finality that closed the matter as thoroughly as a door closing on a draught, that he trusted the county understood clearly now precisely whose courage and whose character this house intended to honour, and that any further discussion of the matter he would consider a discourtesy to his future wife, and therefore to himself. The silence that followed was total, and then, into it, old Mrs. Pruitt's voice, carried up from the crowd's edge where she had come as Margaret's sole family representative, remarked with dry, unhurried satisfaction that it was about time somebody in this county said something worth the breath it cost. And the laughter that followed, real laughter this time, warm and general, broke over the room and swept Lady Cordelia's carefully built cruelty away like ash before a wind, leaving her standing alone in her blue silk, with nothing left to say at all. He found her later, after the ball had resumed its glittering noise around them, and Lady Cordelia had departed early with a headache no one troubled to disbelieve, standing alone on the terrace, where the cold November air still carried the particular bite of the night she had turned him from her door. And he came to stand beside her, without asking leave, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the chill. And neither of them spoke for a long moment, counting, perhaps, the same 3 seconds she had once counted in her own kitchen doorway. She told him, finally, that he had not needed to say all that he had said, that she had been prepared to weather Lady Cordelia's cruelty on her own account, as she had weathered everything else these 3 years past. And he said, with the almost smile finally, for the first time, breaking fully into something real, that he had not done it for her sake alone, though certainly for that, but for his own, because he found he could no longer stand in a room and watch her dignity mistaken for weakness by people who had never once had to earn their own warmth. He said her name then, her given name, Margaret, not Miss Aldern, not the careful, formal address he had maintained even in their most private evenings by the library fire. And the sound of it, in his rough, unadorned voice, landed on her with a weight far heavier than the grand speech he had delivered before the whole assembled county. Because this was not performance. This was only the two of them, and the cold night air, and 11 years of a shuttered heart, finally, cautiously, opening its door. She said his name in return, William, which she had heard spoken only by servants and solicitors until this moment, and felt the strange, private thrill of a threshold crossed that no one else in that glittering house would ever fully understand. He told her, haltingly, in sentences shorter and more halting than any he had used in the ballroom, of his mother, of the conservatory she had loved and the winter it had taken her, of the 11 years he had spent believing that a man protected himself and everyone he loved by wanting less, by needing less, by keeping every door in himself locked against a grief he had never let himself finish feeling. And he said that, watching her bring that same conservatory back to breathing life, without once asking his permission, had undone something in him he had thought permanently settled into cold ash. She did not weep, even now, though she came closer to it on that terrace than she had in 3 long years, and instead reached for his hand, cold from the night air, and held it in both of her own, chapped, capable ones, and told him, with the plain, unglamorous honesty that was the whole of her character, that she had not married him for rescue, though rescue it certainly was, and had not agreed to this marriage for romance, because none had been promised, but that somewhere in the space of a fortnight, spent watching a supposedly cold duke press coins quietly into a gardener's palm and speak gently to a frightened footman about his mother, the transaction they had both agreed to had become, without her quite noticing the moment it happened, something else entirely. Not a bargain any longer, but the beginning of an actual life, one she found, standing here in the cold with her hand in his, she wanted rather badly to keep. He raised her hand then, and pressed his mouth to her cold knuckles with a tenderness that belonged to no transaction at all, and told her, in the fewest words he had ever needed for the largest thing he had ever felt, that she had seen him first as a hungry stranger at her door, and turned him away out of love for people who were not yet his, and that he intended to spend the whole of whatever years were given him, making certain she never again had cause to doubt that in seeing her plainly, in her mended dress, and her chapped hands, and her unglamorous, unshakable dignity, he had seen, for the first time in 11 cold years, exactly what he wanted, and exactly whom he had been waiting for. They stood together on the terrace a long while after that, past the point where either of them had anything left to say, content simply to stand in the cold, with their hands joined, and the noise of the ballroom carrying faintly through the glass doors behind them. And Margaret thought, with a kind of quiet astonishment that had nothing to do with dukedoms or fortunes or any of the glittering currencies Lady Cordelia so prized, that she had come to Hallowmere prepared only to endure a bargain, and had found instead, in the unlikeliest of ragged travellers, a man willing to stand beside her in the cold, for no better reason than that he did not wish to be anywhere she was not. A year turned, as years do, from that cold November to another, and the house that had once held its breath through winter now seemed, to anyone who remembered it before, to breathe easily and often, its shutters thrown open even in the coldest months, its great hall warm enough now that no one gathered in a single room to conserve the fire, its conservatory grown so thoroughly back to life that Fitch had taken to grumbling, with evident pride, that her Grace had left him nothing useful left to do. Ashwell Grange, too, had been restored, its roof mended, and its rose bushes tended by a gardener paid a proper wage. Margaret's mother settled comfortably by her own hearth, with colour returned to her face, her brothers off at school with new boots and full stomachs, and letters home full of Latin complaints their sister read with a private, fierce satisfaction that no amount of silk or silver at Hallowmere had ever matched. Margaret herself, no longer Miss Alden of the mended hems, but the Duchess of Hallowmere, had not entirely given up her plain grey shawl, wore it still on cold mornings in the conservatory when she went out early to see what the frost had spared, though it hung now beside gowns finer than any she had once imagined owning. And she had come, in the space of that turning year, to understand that a woman could hold both, the old, careful thrift that had kept her family alive, and the new, easy warmth that had been offered her without condition, and that neither one cancelled the other out. On this particular evening, 1 year almost precisely from the night a ragged traveller had knocked at her kitchen door, Margaret stood once more in a garden at dusk, though this garden bore no resemblance to the frost-bitten herb beds of Ashwell Grange, glass-walled and warm and green, even as the November sky beyond it purpled toward night, cutting, out of old habit rather than necessity now, the last hardy herbs of the season before the cold fully settled in. She heard his step behind her before he spoke, had come to know the particular sound of it the way she had once known every creak of her old family home, and did not turn, only smiled, and asked, without looking, whether he had come to criticize her pruning again, as he did, with great and entirely undeserved confidence, at least once a fortnight. He came instead to stand beside her, William, no longer the guarded stranger of that first cold winter, but a man who had learned, slowly and by her example, that warmth given freely did not have to be a wound waiting to happen. And he told her, with the almost smile, grown now into something that appeared far more easily than it once had, that he had not come to criticize anything at all, only to tell her that the letters from her brothers had arrived, full of complaints about Latin and requests for a pony each, and that Mrs. Pruitt had written as well, with her usual dry insistence that a warm husband remained, in her considered opinion, a decidedly acceptable exception to her general rule. Margaret laughed, the easy, unguarded laugh of a woman who had long ago stopped counting how rarely she allowed herself such things, and set down her shears and let him take her hand, cold from the evening air, just as it had been that first night, and thought, standing here in this glass room grown green and living where dead pots had once stood, of the fading grey house she had left behind, and the ragged, hungry stranger she had turned from her door, and understood, more fully than any grand ballroom speech had ever made her feel it, that she had not lost the narrow, dutiful life she had once protected so fiercely, but had only, at long last, been given the warmth to grow it wider. Thank you so much for listening to Margaret and William's story all the way to the end. If it moved you even a little, we would love to know, so please leave a comment and tell us which city you were watching from tonight, and what this story made you feel. And if you do not want to miss the next one, please subscribe to the channel, so you never have to wonder what happens next. Until then, wherever you are watching from, we hope tonight finds you warm and seen, and exactly where you are meant to be, the way Margaret finally was, standing in her glass garden at dusk, with cold hands held in warmer ones, the fire behind her lit, the frost outside kept patiently at bay.